Hi, good evening. Colleagues, students, alumni, community members, and distinguished guests, good evening. Welcome to the 7th Annual Attallah Lecture. My name is Josh Greenberg. I have the honor of serving as the Director of the School of Journalism and Communication and the head of the Communication Studies program. The Attallah Lecture is one of several events that are being held during the Faculty of Public Affairs Research Month. Research Month was conceived by our Dean, Andre Plourde, who's in the audience tonight. It's intended to highlight the contributions of the faculty's departments and programs to academic life here on campus and to public life in Ottawa, across Canada, and internationally. I want to congratulate Dean Plourde for bringing Research Month to fruition once again, and to also thank him for his support of our program and this lecture. Others have played important roles behind the scenes in making this evening possible, and I just want to identify a few of them now. Cassie Hodgins, who's the Events and Outreach Coordinator in the Dean's Office, who did a lot of logistical work behind the scenes. Carol Craswell and Colleen Cornelson from the School of Journalism and Communication. And Roger Martin, our IT Coordinator, who developed what I think is a really cool poster for this evening's event. And so please join me in thanking them for their contributions. Not all of you will know the person whose memory we honor with this evening's lecture. Paul Attallah was an important figure in the history of Canadian communication studies and was an important figure in the history of this school. He was the author of two central texts that for many years were staples in the communications curriculum at Francophone universities. In English Canada, his textbook Mediascapes, co-edited with Leslie Shade, introduced hundreds, if not thousands, of students to the field. I see, looking around the room, some of his former students are here, so welcome back to Carleton. It's been a few years. And I think they, like so many others, will remember Professor Attallah as an engaging and captivating teacher. Paul's colleagues will remember him as a spirited debater, someone who never shied away from a good debate, especially if it was about cultural policy, Canadian television, or our understanding of media audiences. When I was hired here a little over 10 years ago, Paul was the associate director of the school and the head of what was then the mass communication program. It's a position he held for 12 years, making him the longest serving associate director and program head in the school's history. I want to thank members of the Attallah family for their support of this event as well. Now, I know I speak for my colleagues when I say that we're absolutely thrilled that Kate Crawford accepted our invitation to deliver this year's Attallah Lecture. Now, as you may know, the event was originally scheduled for last Thursday, when it was going to double as the keynote address for our annual graduate conference. But unfortunately, bad weather and airline cancellations conspired against us. But we're grateful that Dr. Crawford was able to rearrange her schedule and to join us for this week, and that others were able to make this happen by moving a lot of scheduling around. Dr. Crawford, in delivering this address, joins an esteemed and quite diverse group of international scholars who've headlined this event in the past. I'll name a few. I'll name them now. Toby Miller, Lisa Parks, Lisa Nakamura, Gabriella Coleman, Andrew Chadwick, and last year's speaker, Jack Halberstam. Now, despite quite a lot of differences in the focus of their talks, all of the Attallah lectures have provided stimulating and thought-provoking arguments about core issues that are facing Canadian communication studies today. And one of these issues that we face is the rise of big data. Big data has become a big buzzword. For those data scientists and IT specialists who may be in the room, you may think of big data as representing a significant challenge to how we capture, store, search, structure, and visualize the massive volume of information produced by the vast and exponentially growing content that we all provide through our use of online banking, transportation, retail, and telecommunication services that we feed into our search engines and social media platforms. Now, for data analysts, the challenges faced are often how best to extract value from all of this data to improve organization performance, how to understand the changing needs of clients or customers, how to predict future patterns of behavior. But big data represents so much more, and generates as many questions and problems as answers and solutions. And there are important and fundamental limits to what big data can do. And these limits have been central to Dr. Crawford's research for several years. Her work challenges us to think critically about the tension between the potential benefits and false promises of big data. Will large-scale analysis of DNA help cure diseases, or does it usher in a new wave of medical inequality? Will self-tracking devices and wearable technologies that so many of us tether to our bodies help make us healthier and more productive, or does it render us more vulnerable to more intensified surveillance by corporations and the legal system? Will reams of big data produce vast new forms of knowledge, or does it change the very definition of what counts as knowledge? Dr. Crawford's research probes these questions, and it problematizes the myth that with more data comes greater accuracy and truth. Indeed, what she calls the algorithmic illusions of big data obscure important ethical questions about whose needs, interests, and values are excluded from data collection and data analysis practices. Dr. Crawford's bio is impressive. She's a visiting professor at MIT's Center for Civic Media, a principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and a senior fellow at NYU's Information Law Institute. She's published widely on the social context of big data, is writing a book now on data and power for Yale University Press. She's written for the New York Times, the New Inquiry, and the Atlantic, and she sits on the advisory boards of numerous foundations and academic journals. Dr. Crawford is also co-director of the NSF-funded Council for Big Data Ethics and Society. She's going to speak for about 50 minutes or so. There will be lots of time for questions at the end. There is a microphone in the middle aisle, so I'll just ask when the time comes for questions to please line up and ask them at the mic. And you're all, of course, welcome to join us in the atrium for a reception afterward. So I'll ask that you please join me in warmly welcoming our 2015 Attallah lecture speaker, Dr. Kate Crawford.
Well, good evening, everyone. I want to say that I am delighted to be here, and a particular thanks to Josh for getting me into the country, not just once, but twice going through this process. So last time I managed to make it all the way to the airport before a giant snowstorm descended and I had to head all the way back. So it's wonderful to actually be here in the room and to talk with you tonight. So my name's Kate Crawford, and I research these social contexts of what we're calling big data and also algorithmic systems. I tend to do that from thinking from an epistemological perspective, how we think about the definition of knowledge, but also from this ethical perspective. What are the ethics of how we use big data? But tonight I want to share some new work with you, and in particular I'm going to be thinking about the ways in which our bodies are turned into data and how that data is then deployed as truth. So how do our bodies come to be understood through particular kinds of technological platforms? And where can we observe the establishment of data-driven regimes of truth? Another way to put that is, how do you know yourself in the era of big data? So many of us are going to be using network tools and technologies to assist in that process. But these tools, as we know, are never neutral arbiters, and they come with their own affordances, and their capacities are also helping to shape how we see ourselves. But somewhat counterintuitively, I'm going to start with a story about small data. This is Georges Perec, who's one of my favorite authors. He's most well known for a book called Life, a User's Manual. I can see a few people here have actually read that one. And also the particularly notorious novel A Void, which is a book written entirely without the use of the letter E. So clearly George was very much a detail-oriented kind of guy. But last year, after his death, a short folio was released. And it was a novel that he wrote about his memories, in which every single sentence begins, "I remember." And as a beautiful book of recollections, it's strangely affecting because it reminds us of the odd things that populate our memories. Sometimes they're small, they're trivial, they're banal, but somehow this idiosyncratic collection ends up being the sum of who we are. So here are a few of them that I particularly like. In some ways, we can think about this book as a kind of giant self-quantification project. And I find reading Perec's memories fascinating, even though obviously, He was living in the early 1970s in Paris. He's living in a country and a time very different to my own. But I think if you notice some of these points, you'll see some recognition. I mean, certainly around 266 is my favorite. I remember beard tennis. You count the number of beards you spot in the street, 15 for the first, 30 for the second, 40 for the third, and game for the fourth. So frankly, this is contemporary Brooklyn right now. So I'm sure you have a similar situation of beard abundance in Ottawa. So what I find interesting about this is that when Perec was writing this book, he found that he couldn't trust his own memories of the past. When I evoke memories from before the war, he wrote, they refer for me to a period belonging to the realm of myth. And this explains how a memory can be objectively false. So most accounts of witnessing, memory, and self-knowledge are rich with these kinds of ideas of uncertainty, complexity, and slipperiness. How do we recall who we are? Now, if we were living in the classical Greek period and I asked you, how do you know yourself? You might say, well, the self is a soul, and I try to protect it from the earthly passions so that I can spend my time contemplating the divine. Or if it was the 1300s and you were a student of Petrarch, you might say, well, myself is the thing that I can reach through contemplation of God and recognition of my sins. By the Renaissance, we see that in actual fact, your thinking was you. Cogito ergo sum, a sort of Descartesian formulation. But in the period after the Enlightenment, we saw the rise of a different kind of self-knowledge through numbers. And we can think of this longue durée of modernity as a process of concretizing and intensifying that tendency. It's just in the last 100 years or so very recently, that we've been able to assess our own bodies as a set of external numbers. So now if I ask you, how do you know yourself? You might respond by showing me your mobile phone and how you're tracking yourself, or you might point to one of these. This is a wearable self-tracker. Now, put up your hand if you're wearing one of these tonight. I'm kind of curious. Oh, yep, we've got a few. Yes, we have a smattering. Excellent. And who here is using some kind of self-tracking app on their phone? Yes, a few more. Right. So obviously there are a lot of these devices on the market. Fitbit kicked it off in 2008, but they were very quickly followed by a range of other devices, including Jawbone's Up. We had Nike Fuel Band, WeThink's Pulse, and the Shine, as well as Microsoft's Band. And the rapid popularization of these devices, I think, speaks very strongly to their appeal. And they've been described in these very glowing terms as triggering a new culture of personal data and producing a revolution in how individuals understand their own bodies, and that's a quote. So certainly with the kind of shifting complexity and uncertainty of memory, this kind of external data collection can feel wonderful and hopeful even, as a way to keep track of what happens in our lives when somehow all of those memories can feel so ephemeral that we're doomed to forget them. So for those who haven't used a self-tracker, I'm going to give you a very, very brief overview. These are essentially devices that tend to attach to the non-dominant hand where there's less movement. They use a three-axis accelerometer, which basically uses movement and turns that into a particular type of digital measurement. And they can indicate a range of things from steps taken, distance traveled, calories burned, and sleep quality. And then they can also give you a set of textual prompts to ask you things like how you're feeling, what you're eating, and so forth. Some will also record your heartbeat. Now, like Perec's list, it'll tell you something very specific about your months and your years, not as qualitative memories, but rather as a quantitative record of your physical and emotional states. So by continuously recording these kinds of variables, these devices have become an intimate part of everyday life, recording data 24/7, detecting patterns, and inferring habits of our daily and nightly lives. In addition to visualizing this kind of data over time, some wearable trackers also measure galvanic skin response. So essentially, they're using electrical conductance to check your physiological and psychological arousal. Now, that basically means that these trackers are seeking to measure how your sympathetic responses are functioning. And if all of that sounds familiar, it's because it's exactly the same technology that a polygraph uses, or a lie detector. Except now you're carrying one on your wrist, so you have your own personal polygraph. And just as the polygraph was designed as a technology to elicit a type of truth from a suspect, Now you're trying to extract the truth from yourself. Now, obviously, we've always had ways of recording some kind of data about the body. We've had pen and paper, you could write something on your hand, but there's something very seductive about seeing a graph of how many steps you're taking, or watching how your run times are improving, or how your sleep is deepening. And this kind of data can indeed provoke you to exercise more, or eat better, or go to bed earlier. But something else is happening, something that I think is really interesting when you start using a wearable device, something that's less immediately apparent. You are no longer the most authoritative source of data on yourself. So the data that you're unconsciously producing by going about your day is being stored up over time by the parent company, and generally also by a range of third-party data companies that are analyzing that data set for a range of different reasons. And as we're going to see tonight, some of those reasons can actually work directly against the interests of the user. So I think it's really fascinating to see how these companies represent what these devices will do for you. In a paper that I just recently finished with Jessa Lingle and Tara Carpi, we looked at all of the advertising and marketing campaigns of the most dominant devices that are out there. And the first thing we noticed is that they will always trumpet the accuracy of their data collection. So Fitbit describes their accelerometer as feeding into a finely tuned algorithm that looks for motion patterns, while Jawbone notes that it is monitoring your every micro movement, and the Pulse marketing states that the sensor will precisely assess your movements and then run a deep sleep cycle analysis. And I see this as invoking a kind of algorithmic authority. It's saying we have highly accurate processes to reflect back the truth of your body. But they're also promising something well beyond accuracy. They're promising to make you a better person. So you can notice this in the kind of slogans that they deploy. In the case of Jawbone's Up device, the slogan that's most commonly used is "Know yourself, live better." And the tagline that follows says, "Track how you sleep, move and rest, and help you to use that information to feel your best." So basically, through this data account of the self, you can become fitter, healthier, and more productive. A similar kind of message is found in the campaign surrounding the Microsoft Band. This tagline reads, "This device can know me better than I know myself and can help me be a better human." So the woman is, in a way, yielding her self-knowledge to the wearable, and somewhat ironically, the machine makes her a better person. So I see these technologies of tracking as invoking a kind of human cyborg imaginary, which naturally has to take us back to Donna Haraway, who once said, "We are all theorized and fabricated hybrids of machine and organism. The cyborg is a condensed image of both imagination and material reality." So we're looking at something that's part imagination, part fiction, part reality, but sometimes only partly functional. Because of course there are real problems when we attempt to strap a piece of technology to our bodies. Now, tracking enthusiasts like Gary Wolfe, who's the guy who coined the term quantified self, have argued that the precision of trackers is infinitely preferable to the kind of fuzziness and abstraction of words and language. Yet the belief that hard data is a better form of self-knowledge and that it represents some kind of objectivity and accuracy is itself a type of myth. So in our research, we found that each of the devices we tested had their own quirks and limitations of how they functioned. So one of them would actually register exercise if you were waving your arms around, which is fantastic if you're giving a talk. Also, if you're writing a paper, that counts as exercise. Others would actually fail to register any activity at all if you're riding a bike. So it just looked as if you were sitting there and not doing very much. And then when we really looked into the algorithms that were detecting this difference between light and deep sleep, we saw that there were actually pretty crude differences. It was really just getting down to any kind of motion detection equal that you'd moved to some kind of light sleep state. So ultimately, these dropped data points and algorithmic errors are in some ways just irritations if you're looking at your own life. But as we're going to see tonight, this becomes far more serious if that is being used as a kind of objective truth, say by your insurer, your employer, or in a courtroom. So at a larger scale, I'd argue that we're witnessing the creation of an enormous market of paramedical industries. Industries that are outside the traditional medical domain that have access to enormous amounts of data about our bodies. upon which they can make predictions about our health and longevity while being completely outside of the strictures of typical health data laws. So it's not just device makers I'm talking about here, it's also employers. One large US health insurer, Cigna, decided to launch a pilot program where they were going to distribute wearable devices to all of the employees of one of its corporate customers. So this was part of a health program where we'll see what you're doing and we'll try and give you advice. And the minute they would see some kind of issue in the way that somebody's health metrics were coming up, say that they could be pre-diabetic, they would suggest interventions and particular forms of exercise or dietary changes. Now, this might sound like a really fantastic thing. It means your employer in a way is looking out for you. But as a Cigna spokesman said, we can literally bend the cost curve. So this has a very real financial incentive behind it. And I think it also comes at the cost of pressuring workers to give up their data and conform to a particular company's set of ideals. Now, already some companies are using punitive measures, say for employees who are smokers who will suddenly have higher rates of insurance. But imagine what you could do with much more detailed information, where you could actually suggest precise, individualized interventions that would be built specifically for that employee. So we might ask, when a device is supposedly for you, it is in fact a system about you. So just yesterday, and this of course is the media marketing campaign we're about to see everywhere, Apple introduced its new watch, which also functions as a biodata tracker for the wearer. Now, as you will see, this is actually a very interesting moment because we're starting to see a lot of the things that were happening with these wearable self-trackers suddenly move into a watch-type device. However, like Fitbit, it also turns out that the intent is for others to have access to your health and fitness data. So along with the watch, and I find this really interesting, Apple introduced a new software framework called Research Kit. And basically, this is designed to be a research platform so that you can opt in and send the data from everything you do, your running, your heartbeat, and you can give that to medical researchers and you can opt into particular trials. Now, this is already happening for particular disease studies for Parkinson's, for heart disease, for breast cancer, and for asthma. Now, this in itself is actually quite a fascinating way of thinking about mass data collection for medical trials. But I think we need to ask a couple of different questions about how it's going to work. For example, just how representative is this data going to be? If the sample is only drawn from users of the latest model iPhone and the Apple Watch, which are currently the two options, you've automatically skewed the health behavior towards well-off, younger, and generally urban people in the developed world. So that then becomes the default human of your health study. And this is even more stark with the Apple Watch, which is going to retail somewhere between US $350 and $17,000, and is likely to hold the greatest appeal to what we would say might be a wealthy elite. But perhaps an even bigger question here would be, how did we come to a point where our devices are trusted as the best source of self-knowledge, health advice, and self-improvement? How did we get there? So to ask that question, I'm going to go back in time, back over 100 years, to one of the most widespread self-tracking technologies, and one that I'm going to bet that pretty much everybody in this room has in their home right now. This one, the weight scale. So yeah, in many ways, the weight scale really is the progenitor of this moment of self-tracking. And I think it's also a really useful example of how these devices shift from one context to another, from the doctor's office to public squares and to movie cinemas into the home, which is in fact the trajectory of the weight scale. So it was back in 1885 that the public penny scale was first invented in Germany and then very quickly started appearing in North America. And as you can see, it was modeled after the grandfather clock. It had this large dial, and a customer would step up on a plate and you'd insert a penny, and then the weight would shift and show you how much you weighed. Now, these early European public scales came with inscriptions, and you can't see it on this one, but it says, "He who weighs himself knows himself well. He who knows himself well lives well." So I'm pretty sure that Jawbone's campaign of Know Yourself, Live Better was just pretty much cribbing this one from 1885. Now, penny scales had a range of different tricks that they would use to try and get you to step on the plate and part with a penny. They would do things like offer you little cards with Hollywood starlets on them. They would offer to tell your fortune. They would offer you gums and candy, which might seem, again, a bit of a strange thing for a weight scale to be doing. Then they started building games into the scale. So they had a guess your weight scale that was very popular at the time, where basically you would, before you would step up, you would predict what you thought you weighed, and then you would step up, put your penny in, and if you're correct, the penny would come back out. Now, of course, that was all very well and good, but the model here was to try and extract as many pennies from customers as possible. As the Mills Novelty Company once said in their press release, well, this is one of the companies who was actually leasing a lot of these machines, that it is like tapping a gold mine. So by the 1920s, the penny scale was everywhere in North America. It was in subways, banks, movie theaters, and office buildings. And millions of people were using it to weigh themselves in public. And then we start to see stronger admonitions being bolted onto the scales, trying to get more and more people to weigh themselves. And we see this one, which I love: stop, watch your weight, and keep healthy. I mean, this is about the most literal interpretation of policing the body that you can imagine. But then we saw the emergence of the domestic weight scale. And here I'm going to share a set of beautiful images that come from advertising campaigns from the late 1920s right through to the 1960s. And I'd like to thank Kate Meltner, my research assistant, who with me went through all of these archives and found these fantastic images. Now, when we start to see the first advertisements appear for the weight scale, it was very much about trying to emphasize the science of checking your weight, bringing science into the home for a more accurate understanding of what you weigh. And this change of location of the weight scales from the street into the intimate space of the domestic bathroom also came with different moral imperatives. As Hillel Schwartz once wrote, it was a shift from public to private, from the social to the personal, and it also had a semantic shift from the declarative to the conditional, from what this person weighs to what you should weigh and what you could be. So initially, the focus of the penny scale was men's bodies, as the norms for female beauty tended towards roundness and softness. But by the 1920s, women were the focus of campaigns around dieting and weight loss. And so we start to see more women in these advertisements, and we see them posing in lingerie and in sleepwear and girdles, posing provocatively on scales. And you can also see the focus on truth being absolutely front and center right in this one. This is essentially empiricism for the body in its most private moments. Here we have Counselor, the scale that tells the truth. It's fantastic. And we also start to see the emergence of whole new advertising concepts like figure smartness. So the idea is that this data would somehow make you clever, and it would give you real control over your figure. And of course, this reminds me of the ways that these kinds of technologies are intimately bound with subjectivity and identity. We use devices that reflect back a particular type of data, and then that prioritizes that form of data in terms of how we understand our identity. So the obsession became about a numerical representation of weight, as though somehow that number contains the truth of our well-being and attractiveness. Now, of course, a number can only mean so much. For the number on the scale to function as a normalizing technology, it had to operate in tandem with another technology. This is the height and weight chart. Now, this was first devised by a Belgian mathematician, Attallah, back in 1836 from memory. But by the 1920s, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company had taken this mainstream by releasing the standard table for height and weight charts for men and women. And then essentially all doctors would use that to determine what your ideal weight was. So now the number on the weight scale could be compared to a chart, and it would locate your age, your height, and what you should weigh. Together, the scale and the height and weight chart became a powerful dual technology for defining normalcy. Now, of course, this combination of technologies also had seriously negative impacts on the way that people perceive their bodies, and women in particular. Many critics of height-weight charts have argued that it tells us little about the health of the person and fails to account for any kinds of bodies that are different, be they disabled bodies, be they athletic bodies. These are not very good ways of thinking about bodies that aren't completely within that very particular idea of the norm. And of course, we hear these arguments echoed back today in the debates about the BMI, the body mass index. A very similar idea that we have this normalizing technology that doesn't quite capture a lot of people. Nonetheless, after more than a century of the weight scale, it has become a fixture of contemporary life, and numerical weight is a common part of people's self-perception. As one participant in an eating disorders group said when she was asked how she feels, "I don't feel any way until I know the number on the scale. The number tells me how to feel." So the history of the weight scale, I think, powerfully reminds us that self-monitoring technologies are really strong agents in how we perceive ourselves, both individually and collectively. And they then become an agent in a set of processes that seek to normalize human bodies. Now, neither the scale nor the wearable device deals well with people who are too far from the norm. But there are also critical differences between the self-tracking technology of the 20th century and the networked self-trackers of the 21st. So the 20th century weight scale was pretty straightforward. You'd basically get, you'd give it a penny and you'd get a datum. It was about giving you the data in the clear, and it never went back to the parent company. And of course, the height and weight chart was publicly accessible. Whereas users of wearables have so many data points and patterns in their daily lives, which can build up to a very particular type of portrait. And then that can be given to a company that can on-sell that data in a host of ways that the user can't control or limit. Now also, we're told very little about the kinds of cultural and scientific assumptions that undergird the notions of the normal user. And they're simply being, if you have this experience of using a device, you'll just be put in a percentile that tells you where you sit without really telling you much about where that percentile is coming from or what it actually means. And then finally, the economic spoils of this data, be it for the wearable company to show itself off as a big data collector or as a data set to be traded and sold, is never shared with the users who make up that data set. Beyond this, companies like Jawbone and Fitbit get to see pretty interesting aggregated data, the patterns of activity across geography, class, and gender, amongst many possible categories. And I think this God's eye view is actually very significant and politically charged, yet the user will only get to see their individual behavior in comparison to a norm, basically a speck in this sea of larger data. And now we have a brand new twist. Contemporary self-trackers can be used to testify against you in court. And in fact, this is a Canadian invention. Well done, guys. The very first ever case using Fitbit data is happening right now when a law firm decided to use a client's Fitbit data to show in a personal injury case that her levels of activity were considerably below somebody of her age and profession. What's even more interesting here is that they didn't use the raw Fitbit data. They actually turned to an analytics company called Viva Metrica. Now what Viva Metrica does is that they compare Fitbit data to the general population using their own bespoke mix of research, which of course we don't get to see. Now Viva Metrica claim, and I quote, that they define standards for how data is managed, bringing order to the chaos of the wearable, unquote. So you can see that we're getting to see a lot of jostling to become the new height and weight chart for big biodata. Except unlike Metropolitan Life, we don't get to see what kind of system they're using. Now in the current lawsuit, that Fitbit data is being used essentially to support a plaintiff in an injury case. But wearables could just as easily be used by insurers to deny disability claims or by prosecutors seeking a rich source of self-incriminating evidence. All they have to do is seek a court order demanding that that wearable data be handed over. So is this going to change people's relationship to the wearable when you know that it could actually testify against you? And how is the law going to deal with these very different types of witnesses that are emerging? Well, what's interesting, certainly in the US, is that it's just not clear. There's the Fifth Amendment, of course, that protects against your capacity to self-incriminate. So you have the right against self-incrimination. And then the Sixth Amendment allows you to be confronted with the witnesses against you. Now, Canadian courts have similar safeguards, but we might want to ask in this situation, who's the witness? Is it the device? Is it you? Is it the data? Is it the analytics platform that's operating in the background? Now, these are actually really difficult questions because we may be seeing the very beginning of a shift from the quantified self to quantified self-incrimination. And at one level, this maybe shouldn't surprise us. The legal system will always draw on whatever kinds of data is available. So we've seen this with GPS data, we've seen it with Strava data in terms of cycling accidents and court cases there. And of course, there's a whole range of different kinds of remote tracking technologies used by the police, like automatic license plate readers. But the difference here is that wearables are elective. People are choosing to wear them, and by doing so, they're creating something very significant. They're generating a split narrative in the way that their lives are measured. There's their experience, and then there's the data about them. And these might converge or diverge for reasons to do with the fallibility of human memory or the fallibility of those data tracking systems. Now you might also say, well, human expertise is also pretty problematic. I mean, why should we believe an expert witness if they walk into the courtroom and tell us what they think normal human activity is? Well, I think this is true, but we certainly have ways of adjusting for that kind of information. Generally speaking, we'll have expert witnesses for both sides, the defense and the prosecution, and judges and juries are pretty adept at thinking about the general range of human bias and inaccuracy. But when large data sets come into the courtroom, they can be represented as a kind of objective fact, and particularly when the peculiarities of that data collection and all those possible errors are essentially obscured from view. So by giving these proprietary platforms the power to represent reality in a court case, we're accepting these irregularities and errors of hardware and software. And soon we have to start thinking about this Internet of Things as the next generation of court witnesses. The connected car, the internet fridge, and the gaming console might all be able to offer testimony about your life. But these systems are all imperfect, just as human judgment can be. And we should be thinking of wearables and these other forms of data collection as essentially partial witnesses, ones that carry their own affordances and biases, even as they're being represented as fact. So we're in the process of creating enormous, often networked data accounts of our lives. Now, these entities are created in our image, yet they're different from us. Scott Smith has this lovely turn of phrase. He calls them data doubles. And the creation of these kind of doubled accounts also produces a kind of big data anxiety. The fear that all of this data that we're shedding every day is both too revealing of our intimate selves, but it might also misrepresent us. That these data accounts of us are types of memorials, but they in some crucial way might remember us wrong. So we need to ask difficult questions of these data doubles, particularly when the data capturing technologies are so suffused throughout our everyday lives. And now they're moving into the very institutions that promise us democratic process and community safety. So now I'm thinking of a very different type of wearable technology that nonetheless has been getting a lot of press lately, not normally compared to the Fitbit, but nonetheless it is designed to produce an account of truth and to produce better humans. It's the police body cam. So the US government started calling for massive investments in police body cameras right after the killing of Mike Brown by Officer Darren Wilson in 2014, and then following the subsequent protests in Ferguson. Now, surely a police body camera would provide the kind of unbiased perspective that grand jury sorely needed in deciding whether to acquit Wilson or not. It seems like such a simple fix. Just get thousands of tiny little lenses, attach them to police officers, and then finally we will have access to the real. And in fact, the LAPD is about to test this theory by placing a body camera on all of their police officers. So that's 7,000 cameras that are now going into the streets of LA. And basically, this is creating the most enormous trove of data, which of course has a whole range of other problems we won't get into tonight about how you store it and how you deal with all of that data. But of course, only the LAPD will ever see this footage unless ordered by a court. So by classifying the data as police evidence, they've taken the position that this kind of data is exempt from California's Public Records Act, and you won't be successful if you try to request it. So like police incident reports and arrest reports, the new body cam feeds are a type of dark archive, and they'll only be accessible to a few. Now, do police body cams even work? Do they actually reduce police abuse and misconduct? This is I think, basically still an open question. There's one very famous study from the University of Cambridge that suggests that they do. They do help, finding that during a 12-month experiment in a small town in California, use of force by officers wearing cameras fell by 59%, and reports against officers dropped by 87%. So that is extraordinary finding. However, I think we also have to take into account that this particular study, the first author was the police chief of that town, and this became the basis for his master's thesis at UC, which was entitled "The Inescapable Panoptic Gaze, the Effect of Body Cameras and Police Use of Force." And in addition to him actually being able to go into various rooms where the police would be working and say, hey, we're recording you, people were always notified. In addition, this study was actually done in cooperation with Taser, who is the supplier of these particular cameras to the police. So I'm hoping we're going to get a few more studies, hopefully with a few less questions, looking at the efficacy of body cams. But nonetheless, the role of the camera as a data source has never really been straightforward, no matter how we want to paint it. So on one hand, a single video can create the type of international scandal that we saw with Rodney King, or recently in New York with Eric Garner. And we've seen the power of this single shaky video clip as a testament to saying, I was here, this happened, and I saw it. But if we flip the story, we find that video evidence is incredibly open to manipulation, from intentional editing and Photoshop trickery to the far simpler problem that it was only being recorded for part of the time, or that the camera was basically tilted away at a crucial moment. Also, I think a wearable body cam produces a very different type of evidence to a video shot by an onlooker. So an onlooker tends to get the contours of a scene, and they'll see the police moving and they'll see what they're doing just as they will be seeing the suspects. But a body cam only records outwards. So you don't get the officer's physical movements, you don't get their facial expressions, you don't see their proximity to others. You basically get this high definition, unidirectional view of a suspect. Second, they get to keep, store and preserve that video under their own terms. And finally, and most controversially, police can choose when to record and when to switch off. Now, just last week, there was an incident, I'm sure some of you read, of a police shooting in LA where they killed a homeless man. Now, the police were claiming that this homeless man was reaching for the officer's gun, and that's why they shot him. Now, this case is already being described as essentially the first test of LA's body cam initiative. And what's interesting is that the two police were actually wearing police body cams at the time of the incident, but the recording isn't clear. So it's still not certain what actually happened. But what they do have is a range of other sources of evidence. They actually have a witness who was going past and said, oh, I'm going to record this. And so the eyewitness has footage. And then there's also security camera footage. But now we have a whole different question. What kind of evidence is the most important? Is it the police body cams? Are they the official record? Or is it the onlookers? Is it human witnesses? Or is it something else? And in an incident last month in St. Louis, it was revealed that a police officer turned off his dash cam just before a driver who was pulled over was seriously beaten by police. The last sound recorded by the dash cam was the officer saying, basically, hold up until the camera is turned off. You're currently being recorded, but I'm just about to switch it off. And this is, in fact, the last image that it recorded. Now, the driver sustained multiple injuries, and the officer was ultimately charged with a felony, but then the charges were dropped. Now, a spokesman for the St. Louis Attorney's Office said that although the officer's actions were illegal, the charges were dropped because, and I quote, the action of turning off the dashcam video diminished the evidentiary merits of the case. So here, the mere fact that there was a camera present, even if it was off, meant that other forms of evidence, like a beaten driver, were insufficient. So these devices, even when they're seeking to create greater accounts of the truth, are working within systems of power that skew towards those who already possess it. And the data systems can be used to obscure those power relations by further abstracting them out, by making it seem like an impersonal decision. The camera was off, the algorithm did it. You know, we don't want to arrest you, but the database says that you're a potential suspect. But of course, data systems are never outside of social relations because we create data in our own image. Therefore, it will always reflect both human creativity and human bias. So tonight I've been thinking about what it means for these devices to witness us and to witness each other. And I'd like to conclude by thinking about what it means to be partial and this idea of the partiality of data. So the term partiality explicitly reminds us that data is only telling part of the story, a necessarily incomplete account, a fragment. But partiality, of course, has this other meaning, this idea of an inbuilt preference, a tendency, a bias towards something. And we can ask how systems produce particular kinds of benefits and for whom. All data systems are going to have makers, and those makers have ideas about how data will be recognized and how it will be used. So whether we're talking about Uber's God view or OkCupid's matching algorithm, a system is designed to recognize certain types of data over others. And that will always create disparities and hierarchies. A networked system will essentially see the world in a way that supports some perspectives over others. Meanwhile, users, that's those of us who are the subjects of data systems, are operating within a world where the parameters have been shaped by the designs of others. So pictures of our lives are being built from data patterns that can then haunt us for many years. And here I'm thinking of the fact that big data has been used in employment cases, healthcare, access to credit, and even housing. So we're operating within what Julie Cohen has described as the biopolitical public domain, where individual data profiles are assimilated within larger patterns and individual choices and preferences are being nudged in the way that those system designers think is most appropriate. And while there's this strong rhetoric of participation and inclusion, particularly with all of these devices that we're wearing, the watches, the bands, and so forth, when we actually look at the systems and the way that they're collecting biodata, as Cohen argues, there's a near complete lack of transparency regarding algorithms, outputs, and uses of personal information. Now, I tend to think that transparency alone is not going to get us out of this situation. These are far more complex issues, and I think the politics cut a lot deeper. Ultimately, I think we need a lot more focus on who designs systems and the ethics of how those systems are being built. And we also might want to spare a thought for those bodies of data that are being built up around us. Jasbir Puar uses this evocative term of the trace body to describe these shadow forms that are being built in parallel to our physical bodies. They're made up of credit card transactions, search queries, Facebook posts, and of course, wearable data. Now, these trace bodies have a life which is separate to us, even if they share so much in common with our own. They too can be mistreated, surveilled, forgotten, left in a corner. But just as we may not trust our memories to be a perfect and accurate account, neither are they truthful accounts of who we are. We are all partial witnesses together.